Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp. A few things I have to say. One is, we personally are involved both as a lifestyle, the ketogenic diet, but also through my 16 years of clinical practice of what is effective. What do people need to take sometimes, all the time, to support their ketogenic diet? You'll get bits and pieces of this ongoing week after week. It's important to be comprehensive. In one way it's simple, and one way it's a little bit complicated.
Hi, this is Dr. Carl Goldkamp back for another episode of the Keto Naturopath. Some of you are probably wondering that, this group, this podcast and Facebook group and the related social media that is just starting says keto. It says Keto Naturopath. So it should be all about keto. And yet we've started with this history, going deep into the history and the evolution of the ketogenic diet in epilepsy for the most part. We did 2 episodes on that, and this is actually going to be a third. This is important to go a little deeper. So the reason to dig into the history of this and not go on to some more topical issue like exogenous ketones or controversy of whether we use statins or something like that, something that I consider perhaps more fun, is that all of the ideas that we're talking about now, all the ideas that are in the news, that are controversial, that are topical, are actually old ideas. Obviously, statins haven't been around that long. They've been around since the 60s, but haven't been around for hundreds of years. But for the most part, these concepts and the biochemistry and the biology that we talk about relative to human diet, these have been brought up thousands of years ago, if not many hundreds of years ago, and have been looked at pretty thoroughly. So what's the difference? What's the difference now? Well, clearly that we now have the DNA, we have the human genome, we have a technology that really allows us to parse the information to such minute topics and entities that we can add to those conversations. But the larger concepts have been out there. So today, I would title today's a talk, which is going to be on a very narrow period of time, really about 4 years in history, is back when all we had was diet to treat disease, and back when fasting and starvation was considered healthy. How's that for an intriguing off-the-cuff title? And so what do I mean by that? We're going to talk about 3 things. The era of fasting. The era of fasting is really about the late 1800s all the way up through to 1920s until the development of the ketogenic diet. And even through the ketogenic diet application for pediatric epilepsy, as you might remember, the first couple of days were actually a fast for children before they implemented the ketogenic diet. Second, we're going to talk about diabetes. And then third, we're going to talk about cancer. These 3 things we're going to talk about all in essence the same 4 years. The 4 years are from 1920 to 1924. Okay, so let's start. I have some notes here because I can't be that extemporaneous in all these fun little things to talk about. So I'm trying to build a foundation of understanding for all of us. So you can't be fooled. You can be genuinely authoritative with these larger contexts, and a larger context is very important in terms of the history. I think larger context in terms of all the studies that have been done gets a little bit dizzying when people cite study. You go, I don't know. You don't know if the studies are good or bad, but you certainly know that who's ever holding this presentation or talk knows a lot of studies. So that's why I like to rely on history to bring that up to the present. It seems to be a gentler way of providing you with some basic information. Okay, so back in fasting, we now know that fasting was very popular in the turn of the last century, going the 1800s to the 1900s. Upton Sinclair wrote a book on fasting, and he learned how to fast from an osteopath, Conklin and Bernie McFadden. They were out in Battle Creek, Michigan. So it was a big sanatorium for fasting, which became primarily an epicenter for treating pediatric epilepsy. That was the best they had to offer at that time. So this was still a non-conventional. If you went there to go see an osteopath, Dr. Conklin, that you would have been seeing an alternative practitioner. And that was in a day in which all it took to be a doctor was to have a bachelor's degree in medicine, and you were a doctor. So I'm not quite sure what really was alternative, but that was considered alternative. So fasting was used for a lot, and they found that fasting for pediatric epilepsy, they would fast a child for 21, 22 days. Let's call that 3 weeks. So for 3 weeks, this child was on a water fast only. And they would have daily activities, so they wouldn't stay in their room for 3 weeks. So they had a social life. But for 3 weeks, they didn't eat food. So another person would say that is temporary starvation, and they would be correct. And what they found is that there were some beneficial changes in their blood chemistry, and that was primarily the production of ketone bodies. So the discovery of ketone bodies happened along this time, and they were trying to wonder why did fasting, this long period of fasting, a one-time long period of fasting, actually cured about 30% of pediatric epilepsy. And it basically stopped all seizures during the fast, but some seizures came back in lower frequency than they had before for those who were not cured completely, the 70%. So that's pretty interesting. So the whole issue of ketone bodies came up, and the idea was, could there be a diet that would replicate that? Could they be a diet that created ketone bodies? So when I discussed this before, perhaps I gave the impression that, well, Shazam, the ketogenic diet was the answer, and there was one individual smart doctor by the name of Dr. Russell Wilder, who was at the Mayo Clinic, which is in Rochester, New Hampshire. And this was at a time that Dr. Mayo, whose the clinic was named after, was still there as well. So it was kind of a small clinic. What I did not know, this is why it pays to go deeper into history. I wanted to look up some of the people that actually helped Dr. Wilder. And guess what? Dr. Wilder was not a specialist in epilepsy. Dr. Wilder was a specialist in diabetes. And in fact, up until the ability to isolate insulin, which happened in Toronto, Canada, by one or two doctors, a Dr. Banting and his undergraduate assistant, Dr. Best, in 1921, 1922. They later got the Nobel Prize for it. There's a story there too. So anyway, we're still in the pre-insulin phase of treating diabetes. The way they treated diabetics, primarily it was type 1 diabetes that was the issue. Type 2 diabetes was still considered late onset adult diabetes, and it was dealt with a whole different population. What they were concerned primarily was pediatric type 1 diabetes, and that's an autoimmune disease. So that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because children didn't live beyond really 1 year after diagnosis. So there was a diet developed. And this diet was developed by Dr. Allen, who was in Boston at the time, and then went to work for the Rockefeller Research Institute. It was called something slightly different. And then he went on. He was famous. He was the diabetes guy in the world, Dr. Allen. And he then started his own research establishment just outside of New York City in Morristown, New Jersey, around 1918, just when World War I was finishing up. So what about all this? Who cares about all that details? Well, because his diet, I was trying to build up a little drama there. His diet was basically a low or no carb diet, high fat, moderate protein. You can call it the Atkins diet, if you will, the progenitor of the Atkins diet. So this was the diet, but he also added, and I don't know why he added this, was a calorie restricted. So in other words, they didn't eat the number of calories that they needed on a per day basis. They also didn't have any carbs, or had very few carbs. And so that is a starvation diet. So the good news was these children who are on this diet, and adults as well, by the way, that also had type 1 diabetes, they lived longer. They lived for maybe 5 years. So that's a big breakthrough. So he was the guy who came up with the diet, the Allen diet. And it's an interesting era when you think of the larger context. World War I just happened. The largest pandemic in the world just happened, the Spanish flu in 1918. And all these disasters, it was a pretty depressing place. And the world's going to get more depressing in another decade when the Depression came in. So in this window of coming away from World War I and focusing on diabetes, it was a very stringent diet. It had to be followed right down to the molecule almost. So that was important to do. So let's summarize for a second. There was a diet out there already focusing on carbs, that is, getting rid of carbs as to lower the glucose in diabetes for type 1 diabetics. That was working, but it was a pretty hard diet for for kids to stay on. And what happens when they stayed on this Allen diet for diabetes is they did die of both malnutrition, but not diabetes side effects. So it was a pretty tough way to go either way. In 5 years, you're going to die a terrible death, or you can die a terrible death right now by not going on the diet. That was basically the choices of the day. So all these places in the world were working at that diet. So Dr. Wilder in the Mayo Clinic was working with the Allen's diet. They're working with diet, very focused on diet. In fact, especially at the Mayo Clinic, at that time in Rochester, Minnesota, they actually had a whole kitchen designated to helping patients understand specifically the diet they needed to go on. And they would take the height and weight and everything else, but a whole kitchen that was focused on patient care so that patients knew about this. Okay, so we have Dr. Wilder focusing on diabetes. His mentors at the University of Chicago, Dr. Woodyard, is also focused in diabetes as well. So they're all focused on this. So in their world, 1921, 1922, specifically October 1st, 1922 is when insulin was isolated and made in abundance enough so a number of doctors and a number of diabetes centers throughout North America could start treating their patients and figuring out how best to dose it. So that was a big breakthrough. It was amazing. There's books that have been written about it. It's called A Line in the Sand. It was before and after. If you were diabetic after the available of insulin, it was a whole different world for you. And for those that were on this incredibly stringent diet that were alive at the time of insulin was available, it was like the expression was like raising them from the dead. There was diabetic patients that had come to nearly the end of their 5 years, were given as an injection this insulin, and they came out of a coma and they started living a life. They could have more calories. They could have more normal life. Some went on and just, had a normal life, but they later on died of the side effects of diabetes, which was usually coronary heart disease or something like that. But it gave them, and some lived quite long lives up into the 90s. So it was a big variation. But many still simply deferred the side effects of diabetes, which are all terrible, by the way. Okay, so that was diabetes. So we have fasting as this technique, we'll call it, as this treatment, as this therapy. If you fast epileptics, they stop having seizures. For a third, you've cured them for life. At the same time, you had this very stringent diet in the diabetic world. So these two ideas cross-fertilize each other. And here's another thought, by the way. I was thinking, well, gosh, since they're so similar in their treatments, the diabetes and the epilepsy, what do epilepsy and diabetes have in common? Well, apparently that's not a new idea. It's not a new question, but it's a question that has not been actually looked into, has not been researched collectively. If one has epilepsy, they go to a specialist. If one has diabetes, depending on the type, they go to another specialist, and never the twain will meet. So only about 4 or 5 months ago, going through research, has this idea come up. They call these two conditions, epilepsy and diabetes, type 1 and type 2, primarily type 1, as cousin diseases. And they find that in epileptics, that you have different kinds of seizures. You have a local seizure, you have the grand mal seizure, which is you pass out and you're on the ground and you go through a lot of spasms, tonic-clonic. That's what most people imagine in their mind as the stereotype of an epileptic. But so for epileptics, those who have low blood sugar have smaller seizures, what they call partial seizures, and those who have high blood sugar, bigger seizures. So those two are linked, and they're linked by basically having blood sugar in common and not being able to control their blood sugar. So isn't that interesting? Put that in the back of your mind, because basically what we're looking at when we talk about, this is in a podcast about the ketogenic diet, for certainly, but what we're talking about, these are blood sugar problems. These are blood sugar problems that lead to very different manifestations of their illnesses and their disease, if you want to call it that. Okay, third, I want to go on, and I want to say that in 1924, there was a man who was in Germany and England, and he's famous. It's Otto Warburg. And so Otto Warburg had done a lot of research on cancer, and he found, according to him, that cancers had really two things in common. All cancers or tumors had two things in common, is that cancer cells were low in oxygen. That is that they survived in an environment that was low in oxygen. Low in oxygen means lower than oxygen than the rest of the body, right? So it's low in oxygen. They were able to grow in environments low in oxygen. So please remember that. And the other thing is that they grew in an environment that was primarily acidic. So low in oxygen and acidic. And what he found out was that cancer cells were low in oxygen primarily due to what they call a cellular respiration. Think of mitochondria, where we make our energy and so on. I'm going to be a tad simple to keep the story on the big picture. So that cancer cells could switch to a more primitive respiration, a more primitive source of energy. So they switched from using oxygen for respiration, which is what we do. You think about, we breathe, we respire, we use oxygen, right? We feed the oxygen into our blood, the blood goes to wherever it goes in our body, to using sugar. What they used to call fermentation of sugar or glucose. So now we're going, glucose. Where does glucose come from? Well, glucose is ever present, and all our organs, for the most part, can work with glucose. Well, glucose obviously comes from carbs, or it comes from breaking down protein. So you go, well, that's interesting. So this is profound. So what I'm saying is we have three things in common. We have epilepsy, we have diabetes, and we have cancer. All three of these have to do with, call it a sugar metabolism, a glucose metabolism. And since we're talking on a keto podcast, we're talking about ketones, which is clearly the alternative source of fuel. But I just wanted to point out how important this actually is. The context is over 100 years ago. Well, Otto Warburg got his Nobel Prize in 1931. Insulin came out in 1922. They also got a Nobel Prize I think it was a year later, 1923. So all this was happening in an intense period of change. So prior to these sort of discoveries, it was all about diet. And the reason I say this now is when you think about, you have a friend or somebody else, you get them on an alkaline diet, whatever you think that means. Perhaps we'll go into that later on. Whatever you think that means is like, maybe that's good or maybe that's bad. It's probably not bad, but it's probably not as good as you think. And the reason people say that, this is why I'm trying to connect you to this, why there's a grain of truth in that comment, is because cancer grows in an acidic environment. And it's acidic where that cancer is. So the idea is, well, if you have the whole body become alkaline, for one, it's pretty impossible for you to be able to do that. It's just, so that's undoable for the most part. And the other is, we'll feed them oxygen, give them something like hyperbaric oxygen, which is people getting into these like divers chambers and getting on an atmosphere or two of oxygen, and you're giving more oxygen. That's supposed to kill the cancer. Those two therapies, those two ways of thinking in that specific way that I outlined, is very impractical and is not helpful. Hyperbaric oxygen will be helpful when we get into talk about cancer, and I'll tell you why, but it's not for this reason. It's not for pushing oxygen in, so you're getting oxygen into the cancer per se. We'll go a little more detail. Okay, so you followed that, but I wanted you to link up. These three ideas were all linked to glucose. So what would happen if you reduce glucose availability in epilepsy? Well, isn't that what fasting is all about? Do you think they reduced their glucose? You bet they did. They increased ketones. That's what happens when you starve. That's what happens when you fast. Okay, what about diabetes? We had the Allen's diet, which got rid of the carbs and gave them fats. Basically it was the low carb, high fat, moderate protein diet, as well as calorie restricted. Often wonder, if you didn't calorie restrict, that probably would have been a very effective diet. They were so close to perfect, eh? So that's what they did. They reduced the glucose availability in the cancer. Okay, the last thing that I want to sort of connect you with is something really pretty interesting. And that is, now we are at 2018. And in 2004, there was a tome of a book written by Dr. Thomas Siegfried, who is also in Boston. He's from he's from Boston College in Boston, whereas Dr. Allen, when he was working back in the turn of the century, he was at Deaconess Hospital in Boston. So it's interesting, the origin is Boston for both of them. But Thomas Siegfried's, his cancer diet primarily is, and there isn't one size that fits all. It's a general concept to be implemented, and it's implemented in a lot of different ways. It's now starting to get, I think, a lot of research, and some studies have been done back in the 90s. But his diet is basically this. It is no carb, or minimally low carb diet, high fat, moderate protein, also calorie restricted. And ideally, he thinks people should fast for the first 3 or 4 days and then begin just like they did for the pediatric epilepsy. There's variations of ways to implement this, and that was the book that was written in 2004. And I don't know if people implement it with fasting first, but it's a calorie restricted, no or low carb diet that obviously is meant to produce ketones, and ketones are meant to, one, be a lot less inflammation. And by basically taking away the glucose and therefore taking away the environment that cancer can thrive in. So you're shutting off the supply, you're shutting off the energy supply. I think it's very clever, but I want you to know that it's not a new idea. I'm not saying it's bad that it's not new. I'm not sort of undermining all the research that's been out there. I'm saying that good ideas tend to go in cycles. And for whatever reason, the idea gets dropped. And the reason it was dropped in epilepsy is Dilantin came on. So you had various anti-seizures drug. Dilantin in the late 30s was the first that seemed to be partially successful, and it was a lot easier than doing the diet. Diabetes, they couldn't get any better than finding insulin. So they found insulin, and they worked with Eli Lilly and mass-produced, and within a couple of years, anybody in the United States could have insulin, which is amazing considering people would have died within a year or so. So these ideas, we had big financial successes. I didn't say that exactly right. You had big successes that were also financially successful for certain parties and provided a certain ease of implementation of some of these concepts that some of the more basic forms. Remember, I started this off by saying back when all we had was diet. Well, diet is still very, very, very potent in its ability to deal with these conditions. And that's the point that I would love for you to remember with diet. I'm not saying it's a be-all and end-all. I'm saying that we now have all that technology that I talked about before, and we can say the whole world of ketones is now being opened up to us, and it has so many applications. 3 right here: cancer, diabetes, and epilepsy across the board. It's phenomenal. So it's no surprise that you have, epilepsy foundations both in North America, like the Charlie Foundation, or the Matthew Foundation in Europe, primarily the UK, talking about a ketogenic diet. Really, they're talking about is low glucose. They're talking about do what you have to do to have that alternative fuel source, so these kids will not have seizures and can have a normal life. And we talked about that before. Remember, we had the MCT diet and so on. But anyways, you realize the sugar part is encouraged to be as low as possible and to create as many ketones as possible. And it gets a little more sophisticated, but I think if you start with a concept of what are we really trying to do here, that you say there is a big picture, and perhaps it's a little more complicated than this, and we can start doing layers. But if you come from this particular foundational understanding, you'll be able to follow a lot of people's conversations. So we say, what's the ketogenic diet about with cancer? Well, really, you could also say it's all about not having sugar, not having glucose, because glucose feeds cancers when it gets into where the cancer actually is in the body. So those are good combination thoughts. I wanted to go over, and just before I close here, to have a few more closing ideas, summary ideas on what Otto Warburg said. If you remembered nothing else, just remember that I told you that he realized, or he discovered, theorized and discovered, however you want to say that cancer cells grew in low oxygen and they grew in an acidic environment. And that was because they depended on glucose for their source of respiration. was also called using fermentation of sugar, glucose. An interesting way of looking at that. So that's all you have to remember. These next couple of are bonus points in terms of what I think are very appropriate. So, people, when they talk about cancer, certainly, and some of my siblings, they go, well, what causes this? What causes that? When somebody is diagnosed with breast cancer or prostate cancer, or this, well, what caused breast cancer? What caused the prostate cancer? What caused the pancreatic cancer? And sometimes it might be a specific environmental influence, and I'm talking about a toxin in the environment, heavy metal, a pesticide, a chemical runoff from whatever. They're all out there, and so those are all carcinogenic, of course. So that's there as an entity. Toxic substances exposure of toxic substances. Yes, they'll cause something, and it's not going to be good. But the other is a degree of sort of general malnutrition. So Warburg came down when they were asked, what do you think causes cancer? And he would say this. He said, lack of oxygen is not the prime cause of cancer. Toxins, what I've just talked about, are the main cause of cancer. It is the cancer process itself which causes most of the lack of oxygen, not the lack of oxygen causing the cancer process. Very, very important. In his later years, he became convinced that illness resulted from pollution. And this is in line with the findings of a number of other scientists at the time by saying it was what they used to call the cellular terrain. It was the continuous impact of negative events, if you will, so inflammation. And you could summarize all of this by saying, well, inflammation, because you're going to inflammation when you have environmental substances and bad diet and so on and so forth. But it's the end process of a particular organ in a particular place of inflammation leading to basically these other situations that are microenvironments, if you will, that promote or allow a cancer to settle and to develop. Low oxygen and being able to thrive on glucose, fermentation of sugar. So that was the last thing, saying that he believed that at the end of all this, he got the Nobel Prize in 1931 for the two things that I mentioned, but that he felt it was prolonged exposure to toxins, especially in combination with cells that have not been properly nourished, oxygenated, hydrated, and cleansed. And that was the primary cause of cancer. So that will cause a dysfunction, et cetera, et cetera. So that was pretty much the topic I wanted to do for tonight, that you now have pretty much the last of the history of the evolution of the ketogenic diet, because I didn't want you just to think that the ketogenic diet was created or is here today only to treat one thing. It's not here to treat one thing. It's now a tremendous aid for diabetes. It's now a tremendous aid, or is being proven to be a tremendous aid for various cancers, and will probably be used for all cancers, but we can't say that now. It's one of the adjunctive therapies. And of course, it's hugely important in epilepsy. And I'm sure we're going to go on from there. As a slightly off topic, but very much related to the epilepsy, are the other neurological issues such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and ALS and multiple sclerosis. And there's two or three that I can't remember off the cuff. But we'll talk about those later. But just be thinking about that. Maybe this is one last bonus that I'll leave you with. There was an interesting study, and I can't pop it up in front of me, but the study goes this way. And when we start a blog, I'll certainly put all these in things. The study was this way. They started with to evaluate what they call the ketogenic diet. And how they did it, they measured what they called a ketogenic diet that had to be in what they call a 2-to-1 ratio. That is, that you had twice the amount of fat in one's diet as you did total grams of carbohydrate and proteins. And the reason that carbohydrates and proteins are together because they can both yield glucose for the body. So it was a 2-to-1. So that was a line. So they had a chart, and they found that if you were below 2-to-1, and they measured things like neurologic protection, cognitive improvement, and a number of other variables. But they didn't just go from a 1-to-1 diet, that is the amount of fat equal the amount of carbs and protein, that's a 1-to-1, and 2-to-1 is twice as much fat as there is the combination of carbs and proteins, and a 3-to-1 is 3 times the amount of fat as there is. They went all the way up to a 6-to-1 and a 7-to-1 ratio of fat. And they found that the ketosis, if you will, the amount of ketones are generated also went up. So so they had that. What they then decided to do is that they decided to increase just the component, just the variable of the carbs, starting at very low carbs. I'll get the study to speak more thoroughly about this. Very low carbs, and gradually increased, let's say from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40, increased the amount of carbs. And what they found is that, as you would probably predict, that the amount of ketosis and the ketone bodies that were generated dropped off. So what's the point of this? The point of this is that just like all these conversations, it is the variable of carbs, of carbohydrates that we have in our diet on a daily basis that is most acutely important. And this will be the basis of all diets that come out of this. The Atkins diet, which comes out in the 70s, and the diets that are intermittent that develop into pretty much have very little change all the way up to the present. But it's the carbs, it's the variable of carbs we're talking about. So last little rejoinder is that, yes, it's low carbs, as we've talked about, but it's also enough fat. So it's the higher fat and it's the lower carbs together and what they call moderate protein. And all these can be figured out on a per person basis, but I think it's important to know the context of where these came from so you can have a general feeling. There isn't going to be any new little trick coming in here. The only little new thing on the horizon is the whole discussion about exogenous ketones, how useful they are, when should they be used, are they valuable, or are they just very expensive? That will be a fun conversation to have, and we'll probably have more than one discussion because it is a very big topic and a lot of money and a lot of research has been put into that. Okay, that's it for now.
Thanks for listening. For anybody who has any questions, feel free to contact me on our Facebook group, Keto Naturopath, same name as our podcast. I'm open to any questions, and we plod through the good and the bad, the difficult and the easy, week after week.